Okay, this is part two of Unit 3 summary, and I want to talk about industrialization and all of the positive and negative things in regard to industrialization. But before I do that, I wanted to do something that I forgot to do on the first summary, and that is to remind you that on the second question about the negative consequences, I talked about Native Americans, but what I didn't talk about was the negative consequences on Mexicans. We didn't talk about the war with Mexico. I'm not going to talk about the war with Mexico to any great extent, other than to uh, re, suggest you might want to look into that war. You wrote about it, and I also have on chapter 11, I'm sorry, week 11, there is a war and expansion war with Mexico video that's very good, that can help you a lot. So I would suggest that you might want to look at that before you finish writing your second essay about manifest destiny. So you've got negative consequences are basically how we trample over other human beings, including Native Americans and Mexicans. You want to add that into your second essay. Okay, so let's move onward and upward. I want to talk about industrialization. Basically speaking, guys, we're going to talk about three different things in regard to industrialization and what industrialization creates, and that is urbanization, immigration, and then the social movements that are created because of the disastrous effects of early industrialization. So I want to talk about urbanization first. Hopefully we understand that. Let me back up 1 second here. Yeah. So in order for the United States to expand into industrialization, there are basically three things any industrial nation needs to have. First of all, they need raw materials. In the case of American textile mills in the North, that raw material, of course, would be cotton that we will get from the southern states. The other thing that we're going to need for industrialization is a labor force. When the industrial complex in the North begins, its textile industry, they begin by using girls from the countryside to come and work in these factories, particularly as we'll talk about Lowell, Massachusetts, where textile mills are going to spring up. They begin by hiring these girls. The problem is that it's growing so fast, there's not enough girls out there to fill the factories. And so we will begin the process of encouraging immigrants from Europe to pour into the United States in order to create the labor force that's necessary for working in the factories. Of course, these immigrants also will be a huge, because it's a huge influx of population, will also be a huge influx of consumers that will buy the products that we're going to make in these factories. So that's the reason why people are starting to pour in, because of industrialization. What's going to happen is fairly simple. We hopefully understand that we understand that industrialization needs a power source. And in the early 1800s, that power source was water. We put big water wheels into the water that turn, and then turn the machines that will make the products that we want to make. And so when we look at the geography of industrialization, it is basically in the north because we have fast moving rivers. And of course, because of the mountains, we have resources to use. These fast moving rivers would be important for us to turn the big, huge water machine, the water wheels, which of course will turn the machines in the factories. So there are very specific geographic areas where manufacturing is going to happen, which means that people who now are going to work in these factories have to move in that same area. And so what happens is that these immigrants will start building little shacks and things around the factories. And then eventually those shacks will become houses. Houses will, more and more houses. Of course, all of the stores and infrastructure necessary to support those people will start to move in. And of course, that means that we're going to create cities, or what we commonly refer to as urbanization. So urbanization is the process of creating cities. Industrialization in the north will create these large cities very quickly. Again, what we have at these urban centers is the convergence of natural resources, a power source, which of course is the water, means to transport finished products, and sufficient labor force. So in other words, the fast moving rivers are not only good for creating power, but for transporting the goods that we're going to make. And of course, again, the sufficient labor force, which is going to be filled out by the immigrants. As I said, the need for labor is going to be provided in two ways. First of all, the rural population, the girls that lived on the farms, were sent to the early textile mills to make extra money for the family. But again, that's not going to be enough. Immigrants are going to start pouring into the country as well. I use the example of Rochester. I lived in Rochester for about 12 years, and the history of Rochester is very interesting. Rochester is a perfect place to use as an example. If we look at Rochester in, let's say, 1800, it's basically just a trading outpost with Native Americans and frontiersmen going out there, hunting for furs and things of that nature. By the 1820s, Rochester will become one of the major industrial complexes of the North. And the reason why is because it is a convergence of all of those things that we just talked about. It's located on the Great Lakes, which means that we can get grain from places like the Ohio River Valley. It is also located on the Genesee River, which is a very powerful river that's going to turn these wheels that, for the machinery, but also the Genesee River will become an integral part of the Erie Barge Canal, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. The Erie Barge Canal is going to allow Rochester in particular to take the raw material, which in this case is wheat and rye and those kinds of grains, grind them up. All of that's going to be ground up into flour, put into barrels, put onto the barge, and down the Erie Barge Canal toward New York City. So Rochester is a real good example of how industrialization happens very rapidly during this 1820s to 1840s timeframe that we're talking about. Of course, as more and more people, more and more immigrants begin the process of pouring into the cities, these cities are less and less able to keep up with the needs of all of these people. Imagine, if you will, some small town, I taught in Randolph, for example, where all of a sudden tens of thousands of people pour in to go work at some textile mill or some flour mill or whatever. uh, tens of thousands of people pouring into Randolph, New York, they would have absolutely no clue of, what are we going to do with all these people? Where are they going to live? What are we going to do with, how are we going to get food to them? Uh, what are we going to do for sewage? A lot of human waste here. What are we going to do with all of that? How do we provide clean water? All those kinds of problems that cities deal with were huge problems for what was at the time very rural America. So what happens, as we'll talk about in a minute here, what happens is that these people that are pouring in, these immigrants that are pouring in, they just get stuffed into wherever there's any space. They took big houses and chopped them up into small apartments. They added on lean-tos and things onto the side alleys. Just jammed as many people as they possibly can into these chopped up houses and in the alleyways and anywhere where they could find a space. They were just jamming people in. This is going to cause some serious, serious problems. And initially, these immigrants come in and ask, and they say, where are we going to go to the bathroom? And the answer was, find whatever you can, find whatever place you can. And so initially, this initial experience with industrialization is really, really bad. Without proper a sewage system, the cities became these sanitary cesspools, polluted water, rivers of human waste. It's really, people jammed, crammed into tiny spaces. It's not a pretty sight. And of course, once you have this overcrowding and this unsanitary conditions, all kinds of problems are going to occur. Obviously, unsanitary conditions that are going to cause diseases. So we've got diseases running rampant throughout these immigrant ghettos. Hardships, economic hardships and depressions led to crime and constant fighting in these immigrant ghettos. All in all, rapid industrialization due to rapid immigration growth created these urban slums, which have really, to some extent, have not ever gone away. So that's the urbanization piece to this chart: overcrowding, crime, disease, slums. So let's move on to the immigration piece, if I can find it. Let's see, immigration is in week 9. If we go to course materials in week 9, we will see this early industrialization, where am I going? Immigration, there we go. Immigration PowerPoint. All right, so hopefully we understand that the early immigrants, this is a country of immigrants, no matter what anybody else thinks. This is a country of immigrants. Initially, those immigrants were what we call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These are the people that came from England and the English-speaking world. So those were the founding immigrants. And basically speaking, the country is founded, the Constitution is created, all that stuff that we've talked about with that, basically founded for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males to run the whole thing. What we're going to talk about is the process of kind of taking power away from that WASP group and starting to disseminate power into other areas as well. Anyway, by the 1840s, which is now when industrialization is becoming full-blown, more and more people are pouring into this country to work in these factories. So that by the 1840s, we get basically two different groups that come into the United States. Now, before I talk about the groups, I want to just explain very quickly what we call push factors and pull factors. In immigration, we talk about those terms. Push factors: why do the people leave the country that they left? And then pull factors: what is it that's in the new country that is pulling those people into that country? In the case of the Irish, the push factor for the Irish was the potato famine. People were starving to death in Ireland. And so they decided to come to the United States. The key is that they come to the United States with nothing more than the shirts on their backs. In other words, these are not wealthy people. They're not part of that whole meritocracy that the founding fathers had hoped America would become. These are your everyday Joes pouring into the country. Because of the fact that they only come here with their shirts on their backs, a lot of struggles that the Irish will have with the WASPs. The WASPs, as we hopefully will understand, this is an ongoing issue in American history. The immigrant groups come into the United States, and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men constantly pushing back because they are afraid they're going to lose their power, or they're going to lose their jobs, or pick a reason to hate immigrants. Anyway, the Irish push factor was the potato famine. The other large group that's going to come are the Germans. And what's happening in Germany by the 1840s is they're trying to take all these little tiny principalities that used to make up the Holy Roman Empire, and consolidate them all into one united country that we now call Germany. A lot of those people that tried to unite these countries these principalities were now being hunted down, and so they fled those German states to the United States. These people tended to be a little bit more educated, a little bit more with a little bit more money in their pockets, and that's going to come into play pretty seriously. All right, so the Irish population, mostly these are the people that go to work in these factories that are now starting to be created, these textile mills that are now being created. Again, because they're poor. That's one of the reasons why they're hated by the WASP Americans. The other reason why they were hated by WASP America is because they were Roman Catholic. Hopefully we understand that the people who founded the colonies were heavy-duty Protestants. They came here because of the protesting against the Roman Catholic Church and the hatred for the Pope and all that sort of stuff. So the Roman Catholics were not liked at all. And of course, most of the Irish were Roman Catholic. So because of the fact that they were poor, they were the ones that were jammed into these urban centers in the worst living conditions. They were the ones that jammed into alleyways and chopped up houses and places that didn't have bathrooms or didn't have running water or anything of that nature. Also, because of that, they're given the worst jobs of anybody. So for example, one of my favorite quotes was an immigrant that said, "I came to America because I was told that the streets were paved with gold. What I found out is not only the streets were not paved with gold, but the Americans expected for me to pave them for them." In other words, they were the shovel and pick people that dug ditches and created the infrastructure that was important for the United States to continue forward. Okay, the Germans, on the other hand, although they were a little bit different than the WASPs, they were a little bit more appreciated. First of all, because most of them were Protestant like them. Most of them, as I said, brought money with them, and so they could start businesses and they were educated. And so and these are the kinds of people we like to have, right? I mean, these are the intelligent, wealthy people. So these Germans are the ones that didn't stick around the big urban centers for the most part. There were poor Germans, don't misunderstand me, and they lived in the urban ghettos just as much as the Irish did. But a lot of them started to move out toward the west, out toward places like Milwaukee. Um, Hopefully we know that Milwaukee is famous for its beer, and that it was all started by these German immigrants. That they're the ones that set up these huge German beer distribution, manufacturing distribution places. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I would spend a lot more time with this, except this is just a summary. The passage for the poor people was horrendous. They were put onto these old log ships, big cavernous ships, and people would get sick and people would die. Just horrendous stories about these poor immigrants. They would be brought. They come to the New World, and if some sort of plague broke out on the ship. The ship was sent off to some island, and the people were dumped off on islands, and they starved to death. And it was just not a very good situation. As I said, in terms of housing, most of the immigrants that came here without money. They were poor, and but they did have a strong back, and that's what America counted on, their strong back. Immigrants who had no money or skills were placed in these makeshift shelters, old houses that had been divided up into little tiny apartments, cram as many people in as we can, as I already said, hastily build shanties in the backyards or in the alleyways. It was not good for them. Let's see, I'm not going to talk about new immigration. That's in the 1540 course. So these people were given the worst working conditions, the worst living conditions, the most unsanitary living conditions. We're talking about urban centers that literally had rivers of human waste. Though there was no indoor plumbing, they would be just shoved into these places without any kind of bathrooms or water or anything of that nature. So life is pretty rough for these immigrants. So that's the immigrant piece. Let's move on to the social movement. Let me see, I just want to make sure I'm covering all of my bases here. Urbanization, immigration, okay. Yeah, and the other piece is the great social movements of the day. Now, it becomes fairly obvious that the situation in these, particularly in these northern urban centers, has become untenable. Something has to be done about this horrendous environment that we are creating. As a matter of fact, many people considered the fact that we have turned our face, turned away from God. These colonies started as these the light on the hill kind of thing, you know, the new Jerusalem, and place that was supposed to be the sparkling example for the world and all of this. Why on earth are all of our beautiful orchards chopped down and people shoved in there? And why are our rivers crammed with human waste? And why is everything dying and the sun doesn't shine anymore and all that sort of stuff? Why is it happening? And this creates what is called the Second Great Awakening. The answer to why is all this happening? Pretty simple. America has turned its back on God. We need to become born again. We need to get back to God if we want to clean up this mess that we have created. All right, so let's talk about the Second Great Awakening just a little bit. This begins in the early 1800s. Again, we want to revisit the First Great Awakening. That's based on rational Christianity. The Second Great Awakening really rejects rational religion and injects this concept of romance, and where religion is filled with emotion and enthusiasm. God wants us to get out there and change the world, change society. Well, I think that we know, today, for the most part, women and children are the ones who are more involved with religion than men are, and that was true way back then. The women were going to church and listening to their ministers, and their ministers are saying, "Hey, don't be sitting there complaining about the terrible conditions that your city is in. Get out there and do something about it. God wants you to get out there and to be active." And I would suggest that thought process is what creates the social movements, the early social movements of the early 1800s. So thinking that the problems created by industrialization were signs of God's anger, people began to return to churches by the tens of thousands. New sense of religion pushed some people to move against social injustice in America. Again, who are most of these people that are involved that have the time? One of the things that industrialization creates that's really important is a middle class. So you have a husband and wife team where the husband goes to work at the factory, but he's not running the machines. He's the supervisor, the foreman, or maybe an owner of a small business or whatever. And so we create this middle class. The middle class women don't have to go to work. So their job becomes to be the mother, the matriarch of the family, the moral compass of the family, while the husband goes out there and runs around and wades through the human waste out there in the streets. So anyway, these upper class or middle class and upper class women now beginning to listen to the ministers and saying, get out there and do things. And so these women now, again, have the time on their hands to go out there. They're starting to create organizations that are going to fight for things like the women's rights, temperance, educational reform, and the abolition of slavery. I want to talk a little bit. It's the question is in your third essay in your unit test, and it has to do with ideals of domesticity. So we have these women who don't have to go to work. They stay at home and they take care of their kids. They take care of the home. The problem is that eventually the kids grow up and they move out of the house. Now what do we do? But I need to back up a little bit. So now we have this new role that women take over, and that is this role where they are the center of home, creating a sanctuary away from the working world. They are the moral compass in and out of the home. They are the ones who are the icons of purity, taught proper values to their children, taught them to be good citizens and all that sort of stuff. These are the women that become the social agents of change through the social movements. They create this kind of sisterhood to help one another. And all of this is created because of what we commonly refer to today as what is called the empty nest syndrome. Imagine, if you will, I'm sure you probably have seen it happen, where a mother has spent her entire life preparing their children, making sure that they're eating and clothed and all that sort of stuff. Now all of a sudden, all the children are gone. What do I do now? So now you have these women that are sitting around trying to figure out, what do we do now? So this is a confluence of two different things. We have women, because of industrialization, we have this middle class and this culture of women. We have women staying at home, taking care of their kids, and now trying to figure out what to do. Now they're going to church, and because of the Second Great Awakening, they're saying, I can tell you what to do. Get your butts out there and start making change. And that is the birth of the great social movements of the day. All right. First social movement I want to talk about is the women's rights movement. Basically speaking, during this time, up until the 1920s, really, women's role was subordinate to the male. They had no rights at all. They could not own property. Property could not be in their name. If they're single, they belong to their father. If they're married, they belong to their husband. They're basically property. Even if the husband dies, everything that they have is then transferred to the son. And the son could take care of the mother if he wanted to, didn't have to. That wasn't law. They couldn't go to court. They couldn't own property. They couldn't voice their own opinions. They couldn't vote. So what happens in beginning in the 1840s is that women begin looking at the abolitionist movement. They I want to get into this abolitionist movement deal that is now beginning to start. And we're going to talk much more about that later on in the unit 4. But women are saying, okay, yeah, we want to get involved. The problem was that they were going to these movements, they were going to the meetings, the abolitionist meetings, and they were saying, they were told, you go up there in the balcony, and like all nice little girls, you sit there and listen to the men do decision making. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony did not care to listen to that kind of attitude. They were movers and shakers. They wanted to be involved. And so what happens? These guys get together in what is called the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and they create the first of many women's rights movements. Along with Stanton, you got Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and a lot of other very famous women's suffrage. So they get together. Now the question is, what do we do? What is our first line of attack? And the answer was fairly simple for them. The only way that they're going to have any clout, anybody who's going to listen to them, is if they could vote. And so women's suffrage is the first thing on their list. Women's right to vote, very first thing on their list. They needed political power. Okay, and then if you look on here, you'll see there's a lot of women's rights movement people. The second movement is the temperance movement. Temperance movement is basically saying we need to do away with the evils of alcohol. This is also related to all the other things that we've talked about: urbanization, immigration. See, these, particularly the Irish, they became well known for little too much drinking. Again, this was not true across the board. There's just one of those characterizations that are not necessarily true. But let's think about this. Let's see, I'm going to go work for 12 or 14 hours in this factory, and then I'm going to come home to this cramped up apartment that has no heat, has no water, and I'm not even sure if we're going to have any food to eat. So what do? They go to the local pub, which has a big roaring fire. They've got little things you can nibble on as long as you buy alcohol. Of course, they would then come home drunk, beat up their wives and kids. Maybe they get to work the next morning. Maybe they wouldn't. If they did go to work the next morning, they were in a stupor, and so maybe they hurt themselves or killed themselves. And so many of these Christian women, as part of the Second Great Awakening, said, you know what? Alcohol is the devil's brew, and we have to get rid of it. That's the reason why we're in such a terrible shape that we're in. And so this person here that we see on the screen, her name is Carrie Nation. As you can see, she had the Bible in one hand and a little axe on the other hand. And she would go into bars and break up push out all of the guys in there that were drinking. And she would smash the bar and smash the glasses and smash all of the alcohol bottles, all that sort of stuff. And she'd get arrested. But see, these are the upper class, middle class women. You get arrested, their husbands would come, bail them out, and they'd go out there and they'd start busting up things again. This movement is going to create what's called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That's the union that is created to end alcohol. Eventually, if you take 1540, you'll know that this temperance union is very, very influential and will force the government to pass the 18th Amendment, which will lead to prohibition, which is going to cause a lot of problems, but they are very powerful. And of course, I failed to mention that the Seneca Falls obviously is going to lead to the 19th Amendment, which is going to give women the right to vote. So these are very, very important movements. There are people that we just call social workers, for lack of a better word, people like Jane Addams that, again, these are representative of the born again, the empty nester, middle class, upper class women. She takes a large mansion in Chicago, turns it into what's called Hull House. It's called a settlement house. It serves refugees they serve immigrants that need assistance. They give them a bed if they need one. They give them food if they need it. They help them to find jobs. They translate documents for them, send letters out to people in their homeland, all these sorts of things to help these poor immigrants that are just floundering around in these urban ghettos. Dorothea Dix, another good example of the social workers. She sees. Let me back up a second. During an agricultural era, if grandma turned senile and got insane, they just stick her up in the attic, and that would be the end of it. The problem is that with industrialization, now we have all these people just kind of roaming around the streets. And there were no churches or families that could take care of all of these people, and so they're basically roaming around the streets. Eventually, they would be put into insane asylums. Dorothea Dix visited an insane asylum and said, "Oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever seen." I mean, they were chained to walls, placed in cages, tortured, experimented on. And she said, "No, this isn't going to work." And she was in Massachusetts, by the way, and basically forced Massachusetts legislature to begin to pass laws protecting the insane. And that's going to reverberate throughout all the states. So that's the social movements that began. Let's make sure we've got everything taken care of. We talked about urbanization, immigration, the social movements of the day. We talked about the cult of domesticity. This is, again, let me just talk a little bit more about this cult of domesticity. Basically, there is this cult where women are put up on this altar, this pedestal, they are the icon of purity and all this sort of stuff. They weren't supposed to like sex, for example. They were just supposed to procreate. You have sex, yeah, okay, go ahead, so that I could have babies. That was their job. They rarely went outside of the house because their job was to stay at home, to make the house a beautiful place, to raise their children to be fine and upstanding citizens. That was their job. um, when the husband came home from the terrible world out there, like I said, all the rivers of human waste, the wife was there to, have him sit in his favorite lounge chair and take off his shoes and put his slippers on and give him a drink and a cigar or whatever. And that's what good women did. And good women were pure. Good women were conscientious of Christian value, those sorts of things, civic values. That's what the cult of domesticity was all about. And its ramifications on womanhood, it has tremendous ramifications on womanhood, because I'm hoping that you understand that today that concept is still around. There are still men out there that think that that women need to be barefoot and pregnant and stay at home. If you take 1540, you know that, like, especially like in the 1880s and then again in the 1950s, there's this cult will reappear where women stay at home and they do the woman thing and don't go outside of the woman's sphere. But hopefully we know that these movements will push for women to be outside of that sphere. Women's rights, women's right to vote, women's new role, which is, if you think about it, the social movements involve creating a world where my children will be safe, where my children will be happy, that sort of thing. So their involvement, a lot of city things, like, what are we going to do about garbage? What are we going to do about human excrement? What are we going to do about, all these diseases that are going around, et cetera? That's where they begin the process of becoming very active in politics. And of course, that has long-term ramifications. Look at women today. Our vice president-elect is a woman. Yahoo! Okay, so I think I covered all the bases on this industrialization. I will post this essay on Blackboard as well. Hopefully, this will help you to answer the questions on the unit test that is due this coming Friday. If you want to contact me, please do. I'd be happy to Zoom with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions on email or text or anything like that. Stay in touch with me if you need to. Hopefully this is going to be helpful for you. Have a great day. Bye.